Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I just want to say on this side, thank you to all the witnesses, all of you. It takes real courage and courage of conviction to do what you're doing here today. There's a lot of passion in the room, and it's understandable. We get that. I think it's important for us to say here that every single person in this room wants to end the tragedy of gun violence in our country. We just have policy differences on what's the best means to achieve that end, and that's what this is. So it's a healthy debate, and that's what our constitutional republic is founded upon, is healthy debate. So I'm glad you respect that. Look, we just think that this particular bill is not an effective step to achieving that desired end, and that's what it boils down to. In fact, we think it's going to be counterproductive. We're trying to explain that in some of our questions, and we'll do it during the markup as well. My questions are for Professor Malcolm. Thank you for being here. At first, I have just a couple of questions regarding the foundational principles of the Second Amendment, because I'm afraid we're losing some of that. And then second, I want to ask you about effective application of the Second Amendment. Let me get to the foundational principles. I think it's important for us to note what the Second Amendment is based upon. And you've written extensively about the Second Amendment and about how it's based upon and protects our pre-existing right. The Second Amendment doesn't say, for example, the people shall be permitted to be armed for their defense. It doesn't confer rights. The Second Amendment presupposes the right and clarifies that it shall not be infringed. And the question is, why is that? Well, you've written that Sir William Blackstone, for example, noted that gun rights are rooted in the natural right of resistance and self-preservation. Indeed, your scholarship notes the right of self-defense was generally understood in the 18th century by everyone as the first law of nature. And of course, our founders listed it first in the Declaration of Independence's triumvirate of our inalienable rights. So the question is, Professor, when you discuss this with your constitutional law students or when you talk to lay people about it, how do you convey and emphasize the importance of the underlying principle of the Second Amendment?
Yes, the underlying principle was that this was your most fundamental right, your right to protect yourself. It's something that the law could not take away. And Blackstone, who's the great jurist that our founders were so influenced by, said that no country could take away, no government could take away the right to self-defense. And that it's not much comfort for the law to come back later and pick up the pieces. And that's what's happened in a lot of the cases that we've heard about. I mean, that there are people that deserve to have some means of protecting themselves. And that really is the core of the Second Amendment, that it's the right to your individual self-defense. And as I mentioned before, that the police, however much they might want to protect us, can't possibly protect everybody. So the best way for anyone who's in danger to be able to protect themselves is through some means of protecting themselves, having a weapon. And I think that's what the Second Amendment was all about and what the founders understood it to be and what it still needs to have happen.
It's fundamental and it is foundational. And indeed, when we apply that right, it can be very effective. In your written testimony, you noted that there's been an overall decline in firearm homicide since 1991, which correlates with the number of the current number of 39 states that have granted concealed carry permits, for example, on a shall-issue basis. My home state of Louisiana is one, and I have one of those. Do you believe that when states allow trusted law-abiding citizens to exercise their constitutional rights through shall-issue provisions and others like it, that gun violence can indeed be prevented?
Well, it certainly has worked in those states. There hasn't been more gun violence because more people have guns. They have been able to protect themselves, and people who want to harm someone else don't know who's armed and who isn't. So it really is a help that they're in the dark about it. It's a help that some people are prepared to protect themselves. It has not resulted in more gun violence. And in fact, we've heard today that some of the increase in homicides from guns has been from suicide. So it's not law-abiding citizens who need to protect themselves that are causing any problem. It's people who are getting illegal guns, and that seems to be what the real issue is.
Last question, because I'm running out of time. The Heller court made clear that this is an individual right and that this right is fundamental and sacrosanct. Do you believe Heller provides us with enough protection against ill-conceived legislation that may be well-intended, but may run afoul of that Second Amendment right?
Well, Heller really does, but there's some of the lower courts have really not been respecting Heller and have been really ignoring what the Supreme Court was very explicit about. And so I'm really glad now that the Supreme Court seems to be willing to take a case on cert and get back into it, because otherwise the Second Amendment just becomes what Justice Thomas called a constitutional orphan. And we have this Second Amendment right. It's important for all. You can't just obliterate it and ignore the Supreme Court without doing damage generally to all of our rights.
I'm out of time. I yield back. Thank you.